Welcome, everyone, to Latter Daily Digest. We honor creators, and today we have with us the famous or infamous Dr. Thomas Murphy. Murphy, welcome to the show.
Welcome, Gene and Maven. It's great to be here with you.
Thank you. Dr. Murphy is an anthropologist, a real one, I guess I would say, more than myself, because I only ever went as far as a bachelor's degree. So this is one of those things that I think to be called an anthropologist, you got to go a lot further. So that's what Dr. Murphy has done. Your focus is on Native American tribes, I think mostly of the Northern Americas, but I mean, obviously we're always interested in like cultures and tribes from all over, but I do understand that that's your focus. And you initially published one of the first, I guess, for a Mormon audience or cases about DNA studies connecting whether or not the peoples in the Americas are from Jerusalem, as the Book of Mormon claims. And that almost got you in a bit of hot water with the church. And then I think there's a little bit of a rally around you, and you were not excommunicated for your work, if I'm just going off of my memory correctly. But I think later you did end up leaving the church on your own. I that part's a little fuzzy with me, so maybe we'll get a reminder on that. And you've been on Mormon Stories, you've been on Mormonish, you've been on Mormonism Live. It's a great area of expertise you have. But yeah, it's been a little bit since we've had your Mormon story, and we want to know what you have been up to. And it sounds like you've got a project to tell us and our audience about as well. Did I cover it pretty well?
I think so. Maven, I would start by acknowledging you as an anthropologist. You think like an anthropologist. And to me, that is as important as the degree.
Thank you. I appreciate that a lot.
I consider you in our camp.
Okay. I really did feel like out of the thing when, because I still have student loans from it. And so when people say or want to say that social science is a waste of time, I really feel that it's not, because it did change the way that I think about the world. I think in a more comprehensive and better way. So regardless of, wherever it landed me, which I do think I think it changed who I am as a person. So I do think it's actually a part of almost any work that I do, especially on podcasts. It's just not a direct link, I guess, but I don't regret it. That's what I'm trying to say. Yeah.
And, I started calling myself an anthropologist when I was an undergraduate, and I did some undergraduate research, not just in North America, but in Central America.
Okay.
When in the early 90s in Guatemala and in Mexico in the middle 90s. And so I worked with Mayan, Ladino, Zapotec, Nahua communities. The focus in most of those were Mormon members of those communities, except for the Zapotec project, which was had nothing to do with Mormonism. It was a field project looking at kind of in Zapotec ethnobiology, so looking at the relationship between people, plants, and animals within a Zapotec society. I was part of the first group of scientists to document a region of the Zapotec community in the Sierra Madre Sur mountains of Oaxaca. We were the first to document the names of the plants and animals in Zapotec, English, and Latin, and Spanish.
That's I'm remembering now. I know we've talked about this. It's been a couple years, I think, since we talked about this research.
That's so right. And I'll vouch for Maven as, we'll say, a living cultural anthropologist in her podcasting work, right? It's all about exploring how people interact and are living today, right, in podcasting world.
Yeah, very much so. Tom, were you saying that the all but one of your projects was Mormon related? So is it safe to assume these were through BYU?
No, they were not. They were not through BYU. No, they were through undergraduate research at the University of Iowa when I was an undergrad. That was the work in Guatemala. But I did collaborate with David Knowlton at BYU ahead of time, and did a guest appearance in his class. And seek his guidance in the work that I was doing. So David Knowlton was definitely a mentor to me. That was when he was at BYU. He later had I think he got fired from BYU for his research and ended up at the Utah Valley University or State College and then university.
Right. There's a job peril of BYU that your research, the data might get you kicked out.
Yeah, and then I did my graduate work at the University of Washington in Seattle. And I'm still in the Seattle area now.
Okay. But you did.
Okay. So sorry, it's okay if we get the sort of the background, his like mini Mormon story, and then a going over again of his progress, and then we can talk more about all the other things. Is that okay?
Sounds good.
Yeah, sounds good to me. Let's do it with a little bit of an anthropological lens since we've got Maven here.
Okay.
And so, kind of around how did a Mormon get interested in anthropology in a sense? So I was raised in a Latter-day Saint. I was born actually in Los Angeles, or Mexico Ocupado. That's occupied Mexico.
Yeah.
The southern part of California and Los Angeles. But my family was from Idaho. And so even though we were living there, my dad had taken a job at this new company called IBM, where he hoped to get rich and go back to Idaho and farm. He didn't really get rich, but he did get enough money to go back to Idaho to farm. And so he bought a farm kind of in between Burley and Paul area in southern Idaho along the Snake River. And so I grew up early on a farm.
So that's just right over like the Utah, the Idaho-Utah border, that area?
Yeah, right there along the Snake River. And, heavily Mormon area, but not, that area there's a good mix. Like, so my dad's family were not LDS. My dad converted from my mother. And my mother was from an LDS family. So I kind of grew up in between the LDS and non-LDS community. So most of my dad's relatives were like Presbyterians and various versions of evangelical Christianity.
So you were raised in different cultures, more or less?
Yeah, and back in those days, I looked at it kind of like through a lens of the word of wisdom, right? Because all my non-Mormon relatives, a lot of them smoked and drank and that sort of thing. And so we saw ourselves as Mormons as different because we didn't do those things. And I had to learn tolerance for that, right? Because these were people who loved me and that I loved them, and yet they smoked and drank, and
acceptance.
Yeah, I had to learn some acceptance, and I'll admit I probably struggled with it. I was a child, but it certainly had an impression on me that I knew that there were good people that weren't Mormon, and that even good people could smoke and drink, and so that I think did help shape my upbringing. But I grew up there in that kind of Burley, Rupert area. To my parents, though, did get divorced when I was 7 years old, and my mother moved to Rupert and then to Burley, and so I lived in Burley for a few years, and then we moved. My mother remarried to an LDS convert. He was from California, from the Sacramento area, and kind of a little bit of an overzealous convert from a bit of a kind of an extreme right-wing sort of approach. He was definitely an advocate of that kind of wasn't much of a reader, but he was an advocate of like Cleon Skousen, sort of interpretation of Mormonism. And do
you think this was he kind of already maybe had these kinds of political beliefs that they aligned with, or do you think it was? I know sometimes converts feel a lot of pressure to try to fit in with more established generational Mormons, and sometimes they do have a lot more zeal and excitement for the new belief system they have than those of us born and raised in it. Do you think it was out of that?
That could have been part of it, but I think his kind of conservative leanings predated that because his father was a chiropractor, and so there was this kind of anti-medical establishment,
Okay. Yeah.
anti-government leanings that he already had, and then Mormonism kind of validated that, I think.
Yeah.
And he also tended, well, like to imagine himself as a militia member, but never really,
Of course.
never really, other than owning a few guns and things like that, he didn't act on that, but he would subscribe to the John Birch Society literature, and I remember that was some of the early stuff I read when I was a preteen and teenager, was reading some of that John Birch stuff and Ezra Taft Benson and things like that.
That's the ilk I think my dad's family comes from, so I get it. Yeah, there is this kind of weird like militia worship, or this idea of just I don't know if it's like going back to the Danites in Mormonism, or maybe even earlier colonial America, kind of this just, I don't know, vigilante justice and all of that. I guess. Yeah.
Yeah, and then we moved to Pocatello when I was 10 years old, and Pocatello, we lived the longest part of my childhood of any place that I lived, and so that was where my preteen and teen years were in Pocatello. And Pocatello is an interesting town because it's about 50, or at least at that time was about 50% Mormon, 50% non-Mormon. So again, I got a lot of exposure to a deep Mormon culture, but I also had friends who were not Mormon, and who were, more liberal, Democrats, and we were
okay.
And I mean, my stepfather was, even the Republicans were too liberal for him. He was, kind of more of I forget the name of the party that he affiliated with. I think American Party, that's what it was called. And, so it was more on the right wing extreme.
So you didn't feel like you needed to limit your friend arena circle to just Mormons because you had relatives that were nice people that weren't necessarily Mormons and stuff like that.
Yeah, and friends that were Democrats, and then their parents were in the labor movement and stuff, and so I got exposed.
Are you comfortable saying like where you landed on things, or given the exposures you had?
Oh yeah, for sure. What was really formative for me was my high school years when I joined the debate team, and so my debate coach was this feminist, non-Mormon, Mrs. Coe, and she
Did she expand your mind?
Yeah, well, in debate you had to argue two sides of an issue, and she tried to keep her own politics in check, but every now and then, her liberal perspectives and tendencies would come through in a discussion. I don't think she was very impressed with me at the beginning, and I got some of my actually lowest grades I ever got. Were my first quarter of debate, I got a C, my only C, I think, in from high school, college on. But wow. But I think I earned her respect eventually, as I was able to debate both sides of an issue. And once you start looking at or having to advocate the points that you don't necessarily agree with, it really starts to change your perspective. And you start to realize that there's reason, logic, value in both sides of an issue. And so that was really formative for me. I also, that was my friend network. And so I had a girlfriend at the time that was from the opposing high school in town. And she introduced me to kind of like evangelical criticisms. She introduced me to the Godmaker's book, for example.
Okay.
And she was LDS. She was LDS, and her dad was a professor at ISU, but her mom was kind of skeptical. And
did you have a debate Letterman's jacket?
I did get the letter, but I never bought the jacket.
Oh, that's funny.
And anyway, Between my junior and senior year, we moved though to St. Anthony, and St. Anthony is near Rexburg, Idaho.
Okay.
And there I would meet a different girlfriend, the one that would become my wife, Carrie. She was a college student at Ricks College, what's now BYU, Idaho. And so by the time we'd moved, I was pretty skeptical of Mormon claims. Even though I'd been like deacon's quorum president, teacher's quorum president, and
Yeah.
I think in priest quorum they call it like first assistant to the bishop or something like that. And so I'd been, in active leadership and in scouts, that sort of thing. But by my junior year, I was pretty skeptical, and I doubted things. And what I really resisted, I think, was control. I felt like, I guess, I was a teenager, right? I felt like my mother and the church were trying to tell me how to live my life, and I had my own ideas about how I wanted to live my life. And so when we moved to St. Anthony, I had stopped going to church, and my mother negotiated with me that I would go back to church in St. Anthony. So I did go for a while.
Did you say at least to impress a girl?
No, not to impress a girl at all. In fact, Carrie, though she was a student at Ricks College, we met at work. We worked together at McDonald's. And so the church did not
play a role.
It didn't factor in. I mean, she was a student at Ricks, though, so I guess it did factor in that way. But it factored in much more negative way over the time, because Ricks College was also about control, and it was pretty easy to see that they were manipulative and even abusive, and that's a lot of what I was rejecting too, was the abusiveness of my stepfather, who was, very physically abusive, and my mother more on the emotional side of things. And so I could see the way that they were using the Book of Mormon, for example, to set up Nephi as this ideal character, but it's a very abusive family that you see in that initial openings of the Book of Mormon. So I started to piece that stuff together and recognize it pretty early on. And then with Carrie, a really informative experience was we were working together at McDonald's, and she didn't have a car, but I had a car, and I lived out in St. Anthony in the Egan area, for people that might live there. And I would drive from Rexburg back at home, and then after we got off work, usually late at night, it would be like around midnight, and I'd often take Carrie home to her college-approved housing. And one evening we got snowed in, and all the roads out to St. Anthony were closed, covered in snow. At Rexburg, the roads in town, you could still get around in town when at the time we got off work, but I couldn't get out of town. So I mean, my choices were to sleep in my car, maybe freeze to death.
Yeah.
Or Carrie said, well, why don't you come and stay in my apartment? And my brother was with me, so it was my brother and me, and we stayed in her apartment for the evening.
Off campus.
And that kind of changed.
If it's campus approved, then it still has to follow BYU rules, and that is against the rules.
It was completely against the rules to have boys sleep in your apartment. And we didn't actually do anything. We were a couple at that time, but we were not.
But it doesn't matter, and even the snow. I'm assuming somebody got in trouble.
Yeah, we did kiss, but we didn't do anything that beyond
it was cold
trouble beyond that. But the thing is that the perception was worse than the reality, and her roommates tattled on her basically, and said that she had brought boys home to stay in the apartment, and she ended up getting expelled from Ricks College. And her dad worked for the church education service. So he came in, or church education system. He came in and intervened on her behalf, got her
reinstated.
Yeah, got her reinstated, but she'd already missed by that time a couple of weeks of class. And because attendance was part of the grades, she basically failed her classes and had no way to recover. So that experience with the church really, again, soured our, potentially Carrie could have been the person that brought me back into the church, right? I mean,
yeah.
She was cute enough. She could have done it, right? But instead, the church abused her, and together we processed that, and kind of it became, we rallied around each other in opposition to the church rather than rallying around each other.
No. Against each other.
Yeah, or together with the church. So the church definitely left a bit of a sour taste in my mouth. And at that time, I did not want to go on a mission. And I guess we were pretty socialized to get married young. You'd go on your mission, get married would be the standard approach.
Yeah.
Well, we just decided to skip the mission and get married. So ironically, my rebellion was marrying Carrie. That was my
funny
rebellion.
Yeah. I mean, but in our community and that community too, and at that time, yeah, for sure.
Yeah, and fortunately for me, that worked out over the long run. I wouldn't say that we didn't have our challenges over the years. For sure, we have, but it has been a very rewarding result. We're now going to be 40 years married this year.
Congratulations!
And so,
that's right. At any point, did you try to get married in the temple? Try to get sealed?
That would come later. So after I graduated, I had a scholarship to Utah State University. And so I went to Utah State. Carrie and I got an apartment in Hyde Park near Logan, Utah. And I'd commute to campus, and Carrie got a job managing a McDonald's there. And I was then interested in political science and economics. Those were my majors. I had a debate. It was a recruitment scholarship, and I was going to switch to a debate scholarship, but Carrie got pregnant in that first year of our marriage, and we decided. And I joined the U.S. Army Reserve, the U.S. Army Reserves, and so I was scheduled to go to training in Fort Leonard Wood, Missouri, and Fort Lee, Virginia, in the summer of '86. And that was when our daughter was due. And so we didn't realize that the schedule conflict until it was too late. I tried to change it. That didn't work out with the military very well. And so we moved to Iowa so that Carrie could stay with her mother and father while I was at boot camp.
Yeah.
And
wow.
So we ended up then in Iowa, and I walked away from that full ride scholarship. I mean, it was one year of a recruitment. Next year would have been debate, and probably the remainder of the years would have been debate scholarship. But I walked away from it and went through my training, and our daughter was born while I was away at training. And we did over those next few years, when I returned from training, we were living with Carrie's parents. And that's the time where we started to feel a lot of the pressure to go back to church. And they helped us get a little trailer in Davenport, Iowa. And we moved into that trailer. We went through the temple prep classes. And then in, I think it was April or May of 1988, we went through the Chicago temple.
Okay.
So we did get our.
So you're back in the fold.
Yeah, we were back in, but I remember right before we went to the temple, it was like everybody in the temple prep class there was a sacrament meeting devoted to all of us coming up and sharing our stories. And I remember when I bore my testimony, I was very cautious. I bore a testimony in God, but not so much in the church.
Yeah.
But I saw the church as a tool for my relationship with God at the time.
And was that fast and testimony meeting before you attended the temple?
Yeah, before, yeah.
At the graduation, sort of your temple prep class, sort of.
Yeah. And I do remember, being a little cautious, and it was a good group that we went through that class with. And we did have some skepticism in the group. So we had other people we were, I don't want to buy all of this. But we went through the temple. I'm probably taking too long on telling the story.
That's all good.
But we went through the temple, and that actually we had some pretty negative experiences in the temple. And I would say, well, for one thing, I found out that some of the things I'd read in God Makers were not entirely made up, which
instead of being anti-Mormon lies.
Yeah, and the other thing is the way that they treated our daughter. So our daughter was still nursing at the time.
Yeah.
And so they put her in a nursery, and we went through like the washing. We had everything all together in one day, right? So we had washings and anointings, and the endowment, and then our sealing. And so our daughter was in the nursery through all morning, basically, and had not had a chance to nurse or be comforted or taken care of by someone she knew. And so when they released her from the nursery and brought her over to do the temple sealing, she wanted to nurse, right? They brought her into this room. It's full of people in white that she doesn't recognize. Although then she saw me and she said, "That's my dad," know, and Kim comes running to me, and then she sees her mom. And as soon as she sees her mom, she wants to nurse. And they didn't want to do that in front of everybody. Carrie took her, she started crying. And so Carrie took her out in the hall, and she didn't nurse her at the time. She just comforted her and brought her back in. In retrospect, maybe she should have nursed her, but she was trying to make tough decisions in a quick time frame.
Yeah.
So she brings her back in, and then Jessica, our daughter, starts crying again during the ceremony, and it came time for her to be at the altar with us, and the officiator
sealer
told me, he told me to hold her down at the altar, and
didn't seem right.
No, I mean, remember, I'd grown up with child abuse, and I'd recognized the way that the church had been used to justify the abuse that I had experienced. And here I was being asked to abuse my child in the temple, to physically restrain her.
Yeah.
Because this was such an important ceremony.
Right.
And
when she's naturally, overstimulated, hungry, unfamiliar, uncertain, that, she wasn't being bad.
Yeah. You're just trying to communicate the best she knew how. And I mean, she could talk a little by this time, but she couldn't mostly she couldn't communicate exactly what she was feeling without crying.
Families can be together forever unless you have a crying baby.
Yeah.
Right. And so I did what I was told, and I held her down, and that was a turning point for me, because after the thing was over, the officiant said, "Normally we wouldn't ask you to do that sort of thing, but this is so important." And I was infuriated, mostly with myself, that I didn't stand up to him, that I didn't tell him no. And that skepticism that had already been there just kind of began to boil over. And, you know, in the little while after that, I really started doubting more and more. And my stepfather had not my stepfather, my father-in-law had a copy of a book about the salamander letters, because he was the PR person for the church in the Midwest region.
Okay.
And this is like a year after Mark Hoffman killed people in
a couple of years. Yeah, a couple of years.
Yeah.
And so there was a salamander letter books. I read that.
I think the bombings were in October
85.
86. Oh, 85?
Yeah, they were in 85. Yeah.
Oh, okay.
When we were in Logan. And so reading that, learning kind of the Mark Hoffman story, I learned about the Tanner's ministry, and I started checking that out. I learned about Von Brody's No Man Knows My History. And well, even before I learned about those, though, I did have this evening. This might have been before I read the Salamander letter book. I don't remember exactly, but I was really trying to pray for a witness of the Book of Mormon, and you know, the Moroni 10:4 promise. And I was kneeling at our bed our water bed, king size water bed in a trailer.
Okay.
in Davenport, Iowa, and kneeling on the side of the bed, praying for an answer. And I could do this night after night, and nothing's happening, right? And I'm like, I wonder, is that a stupor of thought? You know, if there's nothing's happening. And I remember thinking that, and then thinking, maybe it's just not true. And while I'm kneeling down in prayer, I changed the question. I said, is it not true? And all of a sudden, like, my spine started tingling, my back, my hair stood up, and it was like, it's not true. That's it.
You got elevation for that. Yeah.
And, you know, at the time I struggled to understand that, because it was like, I was using the Mormon process. I was using the process of revelation that we were taught. But the answer I got was the exact opposite of what everybody else seemed to be getting.
Right. You had more evidence of it not being true, and yet you were pushing that aside in order to hope that it's true and hope that you can get a spiritual revelation or something to balance out all the other contradictory things that were in your mind. But once you gave yourself permission to accept the evidence, it was a wonderful experience in a way.
Yeah. And so then I mean, at that time I was working a lot, or I was working on Sundays, but I decided to go back to school. So I enrolled at the University of Iowa and started going back to school. And that's where I read Von Brody. So that was a little bit later. And I was taking some history classes, and eventually I started taking anthropology classes. I had some friends that were taking an anthropology class, and they kept talking about it. This sounded like a really cool class. It was a cultural anthropology class. I really didn't even know what anthropology was. I knew a little bit about archaeology because I had gotten in a debate with this evangelical Christian who kept telling me that there's no archaeology to support the Book of Mormon. And I kept telling him, oh yeah, there was. I showed him the pictures in the Book of Mormon. And he said, he said that, no, those are much later, you know, they're not from the right time frame and stuff. And I'm like, yeah, right. And
he was going for archaeology. You were going for.
So I knew what archaeology was. Once I figured out anthropology, that archaeology and anthropology were connected, I thought, I ought to try that for a major. And so well, the other thing that happened, I got deployed for the Persian Gulf War. So I'd been in the Army Reserve and National Guard, and I got deployed for the war. And when I got deployed, my cultural anthropology professor, his name was Mac Marshall, I had to meet with all my professors because I was going to miss the last 3 or 4 weeks of the semester. And he was the only one who asked me what I thought about being deployed for the war. And I told him, I really don't feel like I want to give my life for the price of oil. That's what it really felt like to me at the time. And he said, in anthropology, we we will often find ourselves in a cultural situation that we don't understand and that we don't agree with. He said, if you approach this like a cultural anthropologist, this is a great opportunity for you.
You're doing ethnography.
You don't have to agree with what's happening in the war around you to study human behavior. And so here's a great opportunity for you to study human behavior in a wartime setting. And that gave me purpose. So when I went to we went to Wisconsin and then to Saudi Arabia and Iraq and Kuwait.
That's right. You're going to the cradle of civilization as well.
Yeah. And my focus was on understanding the people in the military. I didn't have a lot of interaction with the local people. But I started writing these long letters, kind of documenting my experience. Well, I started out with field notes, and then I switched to the letters, and they were letters to carry. And those letters became the basis of my undergraduate honors thesis in anthropology about the Persian Gulf War and what it was like to experience it as a soldier. And so I had lots of conversations with other members of the military, particularly in my unit, which was a medical unit, which was quite interesting because it was a more educated group. There were, about a third of the people who didn't support the war, but they were there because they'd made a commitment like me.
Yeah.
And so we had lots of conversations about that sort of thing. And then there were about a third of the people that were enthusiastic about the war, that we really should be here. This is the right thing to do, that sort of thing. And then the third kind of on the fence, And so they weren't really formal interviews, a lot more informal conversations, participant observation, to put it in anthropology terms. And I really enjoyed that, turned it into an honors thesis. And when I got back, I loved writing an honors thesis. I wanted to do a second and a third one. I did two more.
Oh, yeah.
I did one so I had a double major in anthropology and religion. So my anthropology one was the war. The religion one was a group called the Peyote Way Church of God. It's a group in Arizona that's a schismatic branch off of the LDS Church that combines the use of peyote, a hallucinogenic cactus.
Okay. Yeah, that's what I was thinking. But I wasn't thinking that it would be an offshoot of Mormonism. Yeah.
Yeah, the LDS Church, where they use the word of wisdom and its endorsement of herbs as an endorsement of peyote.
Okay. All right.
And so I was fascinated by this group. I'd read about it in one of my classes. And so I contacted them via telephone and mail at the time. The internet wasn't yet much of a thing. And so we corresponded. I did an undergraduate honors thesis on that based on their newsletters and stuff. And then a third one, because I loved research, I was really enjoying it. I applied for a grant to follow one of my other professors, Nora England. She would win a MacArthur Genius Award while we were traveling to Guatemala together. And she was a Mayan linguist. And I proposed a project related to health research and looking at the word of wisdom in Mayan and Ladino culture. How did the word of wisdom transfer across those cultures? And so that became my undergraduate work in Antigua, Guatemala. And I just loved doing the research. So then I applied for grad school. I ended up out at the University of Washington. And at the University of Washington, I got connected with a professor, Eugene Hun, who was doing research in Oaxaca in southern Mexico. And I was a research assistant for him. And I put together my own proposal of looking at followers of Margarito Bautista, who was a dissident Latter-day Saint who followed a group of Mexicans who broke away from the LDS Church in the 1930s. They were called the Third Convention, and it was all Mexican. The Mexican members of the church kind of broke away. About a third of them in the Mexico City area. They formed their own church. They operated independently of the LDS Church for almost a decade, and then they did end up reconciling in the 40s.
And I know that was a Mormonism Live episode. Were you
Yeah,
on
I
that
did.
episode?
I talked about that a little bit on Mormonism Live. When they reconciled, the two groups stayed apart. The El Reino de Dios en su plenitud, or the Kingdom of God in its fullness, led by Margarita Bautista, and another group led by a man by the name of Lorenzo Coatli in Puebla. They went to Puebla, and I forget off the top of my head their name. But I proposed a research project around that. I did get a limited amount of funding to do it, but not enough to do what I really wanted to do with the project. But I spent several summers in either Oaxaca or Mexico City area, enough to complete my dissertation. And for my dissertation, I had proposed, I was going to look at the Popol Vuh, which is a Mayan text that's treated as scripture and even by LDS members in Guatemala, and a book called Black Elk Speaks, which is by Nicholas Black Elk, Lakota man medicine man, and it's been treated as kind of a Bible of North American tribes. And I was going to do a comparative analysis of those two texts in the Book of Mormon. But my committee came back to me and said, we think you're taking off too much. We think you should narrow your focus to just the Mormon text and not do the Popol Vuh and Black Elk Speaks. And so I narrowed my focus. In the meanwhile, I got a job at Edmonds Community College in Linwood, Washington, which was right near where I lived, and just north of Seattle. And while I was reworking with just a Mormon focus, my dissertation, I was contacted by Brent Metcalf, who I had met. Now I was starting to get involved in the internet, which was emerging at the time, and some listservs. And one of them was like Mormonel, LDS Net, ELWC. I don't even remember what that stood for. These were like listservs where we kind of discussed Mormonism. It was really a fervent environment for a grad student. And I encountered Brett Metcalf through that. He invited me to either recommend or myself to write an article about DNA in the Book of Mormon. And I was not an expert on DNA. I was.
Because that's getting into physical science, biological anthropology.
Yeah. ELWC stands for Electronic Women's Caucus.
Oh yeah, there we go.
Okay.
So
it might have been something different, but yeah.
My primary training was in social cultural anthropology.
Yeah.
But I did take a lot of courses in archaeology and in bio and linguistics as part of my training. And because I was teaching at a community college, I was having to teach across all the fields of anthropology. So I was teaching biological anthropology. So I wasn't, unfamiliar.
Should we define those real quick? I guess it's four main branches. So there's the cultural, which it goes into the past, but I think also, I think of it as more modern and kind of where we're at now and looking at what's happening now and what's influencing people. Then there's the biological, and of course that one is the soft science. The biological anthropology, that's where you get your forensic technicians that we get on the show, like the show Bones, and that has to do with skeletal structures and all kinds of things. I think all
right, and the DNA, of course,
and the DNA. Yeah, right, exactly. And then linguistic, you said, and of course that's tracking and learning about the languages, because the language really has a huge effect on the way our brains work, even and how our societies work. So it's
and
very integrated.
Two of my professors, Nora England, that I went to Guatemala with, and Eugene Hun, that I went to Mexico with, were linguistic anthropologists. So I had some good exposure to linguistic anthropology too.
Yeah, I only had like one class earlier, but it was fascinating. And then the last one is archaeology, and so that's where you're digging it up. You're digging it up in the past. And I had one day where I got to be on a dig in Israel.
Oh wow,
yeah. It was when I was studying. I was at the BYU Jerusalem Center, but there was a BYU alumni that was part of a team excavating an area. And so initially, only 4 students were allowed. There were 3 ancient Near Eastern studies students that he had specifically, contacted and selected out. I guess they didn't consider my major at the time, but when he had come, I had approached him myself, and I was just like, "Hey, do you think there's a chance I could? I don't know if it's even possible, but can I come see you at your site?" And then that's when I found out that there were already plans, and so I got invited along. Yeah, and it was, I mean, it was fun. It was also extremely hot, and it was just dirt. It was so much just dirt and more, and I'm glad that I was at least in an area with a shovel, because I could be moving a bit more. I I had a friend that was put in an area that they knew to be a kitchen, and he was given, one of the little
Trials.
brushes.
Yeah,
Yeah,
the
and
trials and
they're saying, like,
toothbrushes.
yeah, where you're just sifting like grains of sand at a time, grains of dirt, to look for tiny things that, olive pits is what they had said, that those were extremely useful in dating. So yeah, I just don't think I have the patience to sit at a square and just be like, is
You
there,
didn't want a pity job.
especially when there's
Yeah,
like you could spend hours and there's nothing. So yeah. So anyway, I was glad I tried it. Oops, didn't mean to do that. Sorry. I'm glad I tried it, and I was like, this is not for me, for sure.
I did an archaeology field school. I forgot to mention when I was at the University of Iowa as an undergraduate, and that was also pretty important for me because I was still trying to figure out if understand what church I was in and out. We'd go to church sometimes, not sometimes, and I wanted to know from archaeologists themselves whether this stuff was accurate. So I worked on a dig in eastern Iowa, right along the Iowa-Illinois border, along the Mississippi River. It's called Gask Farm, and that gave me a chance to very directly experience what plants and animals were the ancient people of not very far from Nauvoo, Illinois,
Oh
right?
yeah.
What was that ecosystem like? It was completely different from what was described in the Book of Mormon, which was,
No horses,
yeah,
no
yeah,
sheep.
we didn't find any horses, no cattle, no sheep, no goats,
No wheat.
yeah, no wheat. There was a strain of barley, but it was a native strain. It wasn't the Near Eastern strain. But we were finding, sumpweed and sunflower and
Can I
these.
ask you in general? So I know you're expressing some conflict and doubt, but you kind of already had some, or maybe always had this kind of conflicting relationship with the church and your testimony and your studies. Did you find that things you were studying in school, especially even early on, were really big challenges to your faith, or were you already more or less
Working things
nuanced that,
out.
yeah, you could take information and not struggle with it? Because I was quite orthodox, and I struggled. There were definitely times where I'm sitting in class, and I think I only was able to accept some of these ideas that I would have thought were, heretical, earlier on, if I was still at home with my family and, deeply, deeply traditional Southern Utah, right? So it's just the fact that I'm learning this stuff at BYU made it feel, like safe enough
Okay,
to,
yeah,
to consider and accept it. But I really had moments in class sometimes where I was just like, uh-oh, okay, I gotta figure out how this is fine, how this is totally fine with Mormonism, and anyway, it was a thing. It was pretty regular. And I know I wasn't the only one, because what students end up doing at BYU in these anthropology classes, this is how you can tell. This is one of those things that hit them in the testimony, is a random bearing of testimony, even though that's not what's been brought up. So it might be just one subject, about patriarchy or something. And then all of a sudden a student's like, testifying that they believe that Joseph Smith was a prophet and they're really happy to be here, all this kind of stuff. Like, that's how you know. So whatever
yeah,
it is we just talked about, it hit something. Yeah.
yeah. At the University of Iowa, what we'd see like that was the creation versus evolution stuff, right?
Mm.
Because we had a lot of evangelical Christians in the classes,
Oh,
and so when I'm experiencing this, I was already fairly skeptical. So I just wanted to know. I just had
right.
this intense desire to know, and so it did. I wasn't trying to justify my testimony, but I was trying to inform it, if that makes sense, right? And then I'd see these evangelicals, making those sort of rationalizations, trying to defend. And I was young. I laughed at them, and it was like, oh, come on.
Right. That superiority. Yeah. Well, we don't have to worry about
friends
that.
And I would just like, we'd roll our eyes, and even one of my friends was an evangelical Christian. We'd still roll our eyes together.
Yeah.
And
in general, would you agree that anthropology, there's a few courses of study that are extremely detrimental to faith overall? Philosophy definitely seems to be one of those. I would say anthropology is one of those, and divinity school is, ironically, or maybe not ironically, it's understandably another. The dean at BYU Hawaii, Dr. MacArthur, I remember him telling a story about when he went into grad school and it was found out that he was a Mormon, and he studied folklore. That was where he kind of focused in on. He was promised that by the end of the program he would no longer be Mormon and he would no longer be married, and neither of those was true. But anyway, that's always stuck out to me, and it stuck out to me then as like, I really need to hold on to my testimony because the world out there is going to be trying, and I was aware that I was in, I guess, a dangerous field of study, but it was fascinating to me, but potentially dangerous to my testimony.
But he was an example of somebody who could survive it.
Yeah, so it was possible. So it was okay to be where I'm at because it's still possible.
And because I really had I had a bit of skepticism. I wasn't quite so much, but I was trying to understand my testimony. I was trying to. I had a member of my bishopric in the University in Iowa City, and he was a professor in communications at the University of Iowa. And he's the one that introduced me to Sunstone and dialogue and stuff like that. And so I was I started attending Sunstone symposia. I started going to John Whitmer Historical Association and Mormon History Association meetings. And so I was kind of hobnobbing with the intellectual Mormons. So it was more like I was
like there was something there at its core, because you had to know a lot of things for sure didn't line up already. So were you still thinking like, maybe I can find something, maybe there is stuff out there? Or was it, I don't know, were you looking for, I guess, kind of like the non-literal believers where there's still maybe some heart and soul in it that's worth keeping?
I wasn't trying hard to believe. I guess I had kind of, the cultural relativism of anthropology really appealed to me.
Yeah.
And because I'd had those diverse experiences as a child, I really was attracted by the idea that different cultures have different ways of explaining things, and that they all have their own logic and their own rationale. And so I was curious about how my cultural tradition had come to understand itself. So I was interested in the process rather than reaffirming faith, if that makes sense.
Or even just coming to a conclusion about it, I guess, is what.
Yeah. And trying, it was my story in the sense that I was raised Mormon. And so I wanted to understand myself and my community. But I wasn't trying to reaffirm testimony by that time. That prayer where I had concluded that it wasn't true had
more or less gone.
Had shifted.
You are approaching your Mormon studies as an anthropologist now.
I had kind of let go of the idea that it was true already. At that time I thought God had told me that wasn't true. As I got further along, I realized that even that idea that God speaks to us in our prayers is a cultural construct. And so I definitely even question that experience. But the way I see it now is that I kind of like you were saying earlier, Maven, I started to build up those doubts and stuff, and I was pushing them away. And when I had that kind of intuitive moment where I'm just like, well, maybe it isn't true. And it's like a flood of emotion.
Yeah.
With that release of that pent up doubt. And And so that's how I see it now.
It's a pretty common experience I've seen in deconstruction. It is a moment, and I had tried to do this as an exercise when I was fully believing, with, to genuinely try to consider, just for an intellectual exercise, is it possible that the church isn't true? But because it never really was a possibility in my mind when I was asking that, it purely was just a hypothetical, kind of adventure to go on. But when things built up enough that it was a genuine question, yeah, like, is it all bullshit? Then it's like, it is. As soon as you say it, as soon as you allow the honest question, and I've heard so many other people express something very similar, that just everything makes sense. Everything just kind of clicks into place almost. And it's like, of course, it's obvious. Yeah.
And I think I had trouble letting go of my Mormon identity too. I still do, right?
Sure.
It's like it's how I came to understand myself, and I can't imagine myself existing without some relationship to that. So
and struggling
anyway,
with this,
yeah,
does that sort of take you into the DNA arena?
Yeah. So back to the story of the chronology there. So Brent Metcalf had asked me if I would write this article, and it was going to be for a new online journal called Mormon Scripture Studies, which was a peer-reviewed journal. So I didn't realize it at the time, but that would make it the first peer-reviewed article on DNA in the Book of Mormon. There was an article that had been published by Simon Southerton prior to this that was an exit, kind of a leaving Mormonism sort of online testimony, where he had told his story, and I did read that, and that was very informative for my research. But mostly I went into the scientific journals and I dug through them as, all right, what does the DNA evidence say? And in the end, the conclusion was that there was no affirmative evidence to support the idea that people came from Israel to the ancient America, or to ancient America.
What if it had, just out of curiosity? And did you think it was possible that it could show that?
Yeah, I thought it might be possible, because I was a big fan already of Vine Deloria Jr. And he was a Dakota philosopher. He'd written books like God is Red and Custer Died for Your Sins, or he wrote a book on creation and evolution, and kind of a native pushback to that. And he was quite critical of the Bering Land Bridge thing.
Were these sort of like native spiritual books?
Yeah. And he thought, there might have been some contact, some
transatlantic
contact. And so I was definitely open to that possibility. I think if we had found it, it would be kind of cool.
Yeah.
We do find it in DNA. So eventually this is after that. Well, I mean, there were a couple of hints of it when I published Laymanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics, that there was a Polynesian Native American connection.
Mm-hmm.
And not of Native Americans going to Polynesia, but the other way around. I mean, actually, it's not entirely clear who crossed what areas, but what we do see is some Native American DNA early on in Polynesia, and some Polynesian DNA early on in the Americas, especially in Mexico, in kind of the Central America.
Yeah.
North part of South America. Yeah. And so there was around 1000 AD, some travel between the Americas and Easter Island, especially, but even
so just a small timeline problem as far as the Book of Mormon goes.
But it's still fascinating.
Yeah, it is.
Yeah, still fascinating. And I mean, just imagining those people that long ago out traveling is pretty amazing. And there's also been some Native American migration into into Greenland, Iceland type area. And so, and probably associated with around that same time, the Vikings coming to the Americas. And we do have archaeological evidence of that. and traveling back. And so there is some DNA exchange that occurs, but it's very limited, and it's in very small regions. It's not in the ancient Near East. It's not like seafarers coming out of the Mediterranean or Europe, Africa, or the Middle East. You just don't see that, other than kind of those two examples I gave. So that publishing that article did create a bit of a storm. It came out in a book. Well, it was first in Mormon Scripture Studies. We discussed it at the Sunstone Symposia. And
what year was that?
2001.
Yeah. Because the church did have a definitive statement at this time. I think doctrinally, but it also was in the front of the Book of Mormon.
Right. Yeah. In 1981, they put in an introduction that said that the Lamanites were the principal ancestors of the American Indians. And so I had, really shown in that article that was impossible.
And you didn't go into this trying to prove anything one way or the other. You're just saying, here is science. Let's address science to this problem, this question.
Yeah, and if the evidence had supported the possibility of Israelite migrations, that's what I would have reported. I was doing a literature review. I wasn't trying to prove one side or the other. I was trying to say,
you weren't an angry, bitter ex-Mormon, writing your early version of the CES letter and haha, I got you.
No, right? Not at all.
Yeah. No, just a normal academic exercise.
And curious, and wanting to understand the Book of Mormon text, where did it come from? And so that did, though, create a bit of a firestorm. By this time, I was pretty inactive. I'd never attended church since I'd moved to the Seattle area, except like when I'd go visit family or things like that. And I did go a couple of times when I was in Oaxaca, in southern Mexico, but otherwise I didn't really go to church. And so the first time I went into the Linwood Stake Center, where I was living in Western Washington, was when I was invited by the stake president to come talk to him about this article that had been republished in a book called American Apocrypha. And the article was Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics. So that came out in 2002. And so this is November of 2002, the day before Thanksgiving. I meet with the stake president, and he has a copy of my article.
Yeah, was it's just sounding suspicious to me already. And just from what I know of other academic type issues like this, where your membership is put in jeopardy, there's almost always someone higher up that gets pissed off, and they're the ones. So who did you piss off?
Well, don't know for sure, but someone had sent him a copy of the article.
No DNA evidence.
Yeah, they'd sent him a copy of the Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics. He didn't.
Who was it? I missed the name. Sorry.
Lamanite Genesis, Genealogy, and Genetics.
But who was it? You did you give a name of someone that had been?
The stake president.
Just the stake president. So not someone higher. It did start at the local level.
No. Someone had sent it to the stake president.
Oh, okay.
I'm assuming it was the Strengthening Church Members Committee, but I didn't know about the Strengthening Church Committee. Church. I didn't know of the Strengthening Church Membership.
The SCMC.
And so I didn't know how he got it. He just had a copy, and he said that it was inappropriate for a church member to make the conclusions. He actually read my conclusion to me, and asked me if I would reconsider it. And I said no. And then I said, well, if the evidence changed, I would, but otherwise, no. And he said, well, in that case, then we should schedule a disciplinary council to consider you for apostasy. And I said, well, if that's what you want to do, then let's do it sooner rather than later.
Yeah.
And so we agreed.
You don't think he was getting instructions or encouragement from any higher ups for him,
like an area rep? Or
I do. Well, obviously they sent him that article and wanted him to deal with me. So
because it wasn't just a side interest that he had.
Yeah, I mean, so if I'll get ahead of myself in the story, but I did eventually ask him this question directly.
Okay.
And so after he had
started the proceedings.
Yeah, so we scheduled the disciplinary council, and I shared news of this with a few people via email, and then folks from Signature Books asked if they could share it with the Associated Press, and I said yes. They shared it with Associated Press, and it really blew up into this huge news story.
Yeah.
And there were lots of articles coming out, and the LA Times was doing a big special on it. They were calling me the Galileo of Mormonism, of all things, which I think was blown out of proportion. But they were calling my stake president the Inquisitor, and that he explained to me that later that was a turning point for him. When he was being accused of being an inquisitor, and he saw himself, as he explained it to me, that he was trying to do this out of love and care for me, and that I had told the newspaper that I did not want to be excommunicated.
Mm-hmm.
And so he
thought you were being dishonest and villainizing him.
Yeah. And so he halted the disciplinary action the night before that LA Times article came out. And so that there were a bunch of protests that went on still in my support. And he, at the time, he'd used the words indefinitely postpone the disciplinary action. And a few months later, he contacted me again, and we met. Fox News was outside in the parking lot waiting for a result. They were excited to have a story in Sweeps Week, and basically he called it off.
Okay.
Which is
nice.
He halted the discipline entirely. So he said, I'm not going to be disciplined for this work. It's
better than leaving it open, because there's something kind of, I think, manipulative a little bit. I just a gross of just this indefinite postponement that is perpetually always hanging over you. So I'm glad he at least did that. Yeah. And said,
and so I asked him, if he had felt pressure to excommunicate me, and he said quite the opposite. He said, no, quite the opposite, which was an interesting response. Then he kind of backed up a little bit and said, trying to clarify, and he said they always emphasized it was my decision. So
they brought it up to you for your awareness.
I think that he probably got, this is my hypothesis, is that he got a letter from the SCMC that said, you got this member of your ward or state that's published this material, you need to deal with him. And then seeing it as apostasy, he felt the most appropriate way to deal with me was to excommunicate me. Yeah. So then he proceeds that way. It blows up, and undoubtedly he's talking back and forth with people at Salt Lake at this point about how to handle the situation, because it's become a nightmare for the church that they're excommunicating this graduate student for an article on DNA in the Book of Mormon.
David and Goliath.
Anti-science. And I think the people at Salt Lake at that time reassured him that if he decided not to excommunicate me, that would be okay.
Okay.
I think that's where his initial response, quite the opposite, was that they had given him the okay to not
kerfuffle. Okay.
That's my hypothesis.
It's reasonable. I think it's a reasonable hypothesis. Yeah. And so for this, life moved on, or were you like, bag this? I'm actually just going to resign myself.
That's, that was another turning point in my career. I did go on, finish my PhD. The DNA work was part of my PhD dissertation, but so was the work I did in Mexico with the Margarita Bautista's group. And the dissertation was called Imagining Lamanites, Native Americans in the Book of Mormon. And kind of, I think what its most important contribution is not the DNA, but instead it was really the first critical analysis of the emergence of a Lamanite ethnicity. of people seeing themselves as Lamanites. And I think that's what the dissertation will probably be remembered more for in the long run than the DNA. Although in the short run, it's the DNA that has predominated. And I also experienced a lot of backlash from farms and fair who published numerous articles, some of them quite harsh personally, about me.
That tracks. Yeah.
Yeah. And very, very negative kind of character assassination type of stuff. It really kind of soured me towards the field of Mormon studies, thinking that this isn't a genuine search for truth. That's
right. And they don't even have to be asked to do that. They can just start attacking because it's just in their DNA.
Yeah, where the other people I'd experienced before at Sunstone and MHA and JWHA were actually kind, open
They're
to
interested in
evidence,
scholarship,
ideas. Yeah. So and this experience with fair and farms was such a contrast, and it was emotionally painful. And I only have a certain amount of capacity for dealing with that stuff, and I had other opportunities appearing in my life. I'd gotten this job at Edmonds Community College. I was flourishing in that role. I was given an opportunity to build a service learning community-based anthropology program. And
you talk about that, I think, when you come back to Mormon Stories.
And I built this environmental anthropology field school that was deeply rewarding to me personally. We're able to work closely with a lot of Coast Salish tribes. That's the indigenous people where I live here in Western Washington, and help them with really important concerns like repatriating salmon to the site of the Point Elliott Treaty, traveling with students on tribal canoe journey in support of the tribal canoe families. Just very richly rewarding experience that was an alternative.
Like, I don't need farms. I don't need fair.
Don't need the Mormon distraction.
And I didn't have capacity for both. And I noticed at the time that when I was working on the Mormon stuff that I would get angry. And I would get frustrated. And so I was like, well, it's not healthy for me. And I needed a break. And I took a break that was almost a decade long.
So did John DeLynn ask you to come on his show during that decade and you just kept on saying no?
No. I wasn't aware of the emergence of a lot of these podcasts at the time. I just wasn't paying attention.
Off your radar.
Yeah, but things did start to change.
I think John became aware of you with the AP article. He became very aware of you at that time, if I'm recalling correctly.
Because he was living nearby, right?
Yeah, and he was. There's this mystery that I would tell the way I remember it, okay? And it was, I think it would have been Sunstone in 2004 or 2005, one or the other. And I was asked by John, what is John's last name? He was the guy that followed Albert Peck as the head of Sunstone. And he was involved with John DeLynn later in
not John Larson. No, different John. Over.
Yeah. And
okay.
Anyway, he was the head of Sunstone. He asked me if I wanted to be interviewed by this podcaster, and that was going to be a podcast through Sunstone. I didn't know what a podcast was, and I said, "Well, this is like a radio interview, but it's on the internet." I said, "Okay, well, I'll do that." So I went and I was interviewed, and I remember the guy was tall, and his name was John, who interviewed me, but nothing happened to that interview. To my knowledge, it was never released. And later, when I did start corresponding with John DeLynn, I thought, I wonder if that was John DeLynn, because he looked a lot like I remembered the guy. And John said he'd had no memory of this. So I don't know. If somebody can help me solve that mystery, I'd love to figure out where that interview was, what happened to it.
That'd be interesting.
Was it Dan Witherspoon that you're?
Yes, Dan Witherspoon. That's right. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
That took over Sunstone for Peck.
Yeah. Yeah. And, like I mixed up that name. I could have some details wrong, and, memory is a faulty thing, but that's the way I remembered. I went and was interviewed, and to my knowledge, nothing ever came of that. It was never publicly released. But when I did start getting interested in Mormonism again was when I was asked in 2014 to review a book called Book of Mormon, a biography by Paul Gutjahr. And I was asked to interview it for a journal called Nova Religio. And when I agreed to do it, and what I noticed in that book is that there was no mention at all of any reference to Native Americans. They did mention my DNA work, but he didn't mention any Native perspectives. And one of the things I tried to do with my dissertation is bring Native scholarship into that discussion of what is a Lamanite identity. So I cited a lot of people like Vine Deloria Jr., like George Tinker, and I also went through a historical record of indigenous Mormons who had proclaimed a Layman identity, and kind of did as best I could a literary review of that. And then I focused on the writings of Margarito Bautista, a Nahua theologian, really, who identified himself as a Lamanite. And he produced the largest body of literature probably in the 20th century by somebody self-identifying as a Lamanite. And so I was curious, why would Paul Gutjahr, even after I'd published my dissertation, I'd published a book in Journal of Mormon History, or an article in Journal of Mormon History about this. I'd published an ethnohistory about it, and yet it was completely ignored. It was very similar to Terrell Gibbons' book, By the Hand of Mormon, that I had reviewed back in 2002, where he, again, never discusses any Native scholars.
But we know why.
Is supposed to be about Native people.
Yeah.
And yet the Native voices are absent.
But who could be better to write about Native people than a white man?
Right. And so that was kind of my motivation to re-engage, is like I felt like I left something undone. That if Paul Gutjahr could make the same mistakes that Terrell Gibbons had done over a decade earlier, and then I needed to be more engaged. I thought, especially my good friend Angelo Baca, he'd done this film in layman's terms that brought a lot of indigenous perspectives on Lamanite identity into the public sphere in a documentary film, but it was being ignored by Mormons. And around the same, shortly after that was the Mitt Romney campaign for president, and so it's like the Mormon moment, and still indigenous voices are completely shut down and marginalized. And so it was in that context that I started listening to podcasts again.
You were in a perfect position to be an advocate, a champion of getting the indigenous voices heard. And you can also springboard from your infamy.
Well, I would frame it a little differently, Gene. Okay. I would frame it a little bit differently. What I could do, I'm not a best to represent Native people, but what I could do was engage them in dialogue around the things that they were saying about the Book of Mormon, which is what Mormon scholars were ignoring. But Native scholars were producing their own work. It was just being ignored. So I could be that
facilitator
voice within Mormon studies that's engaging in dialogue, not as an anthropologist that represents them, but as an anthropologist that respects them and is willing to
make space for them in and elevate their voice. Yeah.
Yeah. And so that became a motivation for coming back into the field. Around that time, there was a woman by the name of Joanna Brooks, which many of you will know, who was working on an anthology with Gina Colvin, who I had started listening to her podcast, and it was going to be on decolonizing Mormonism. And so I saw that Joanna Brooks had done a public presentation about that. So I wrote to her asking for if she could share what she had presented, her presentation, because I was interested in decolonizing Mormonism. And she said, well, in fact, we are writing a book about this. We have an anthology. And would you be interested in submitting an article to this anthology? And then we would exchange and share resources and stuff. And so I agreed to do that. I was already, like I said, a big fan of Gina Colvin. And so I wrote an article for Decolonizing Mormonism. And then Angelo Baca and I had been talking ever since he did his film. His film was like, it was an indigenous perspective on the same topics as my dissertation, but in a film rather than print format. Okay. So
Right, okay.
we had bonded over that. I'd helped him. He'd helped me. We bonded over that. We'd continued to work together on other topics and other fields. So that had nothing to do with Mormonism. And so Angelo and I got talking about, I asked Angelo when I decided to come back to Mormon studies, I'm like, what are the pressing issues that indigenous people would like to see addressed? And the issue he brought up that was most important was repatriation issues. And so we had been discussing repatriation issues related to Kennewick Man when in the 90s, because it was such a big deal at the University of Washington. And so Angelo and I produced an article for Open Theology called Rejecting Racism, Latter-day Saint Religion, Rhetoric, and Repatriation, trying to open a conversation about the inappropriateness of Latter-day Saint origin stories, where Joseph Smith is basically looting Moroni's grave to try to get these gold plates, and that the plates would have never really belonged to Joseph Smith in the first place, and that the means that Joseph and his associates were using to access dead Indians essentially were native artifacts.
That's interesting.
Yeah,
it's taking the story of the Book of Mormon very, very literally,
Yeah, well,
it's problematic either way.
Certainly. Yeah, even if you don't accept that there were actually gold plates, that there were actual indigenous artifacts involved in the process in the seer stones, at least some of them. And so,
and of course, their stories.
Yeah. We wrote about that, about the need to return those seer stones. If they are what we claim them to be, to have those kind of powers, then they belong to the native people from whom they were stolen. And we also brought it in relationship to a lot of contemporary issues, particularly the Bears Ears National Monument. At that time, there was a group of Mormon militiamen at Malheur Wildlife Refuge, the Bundy family, that were taking over a federal refuge and desecrating native cultural remains there.
Right.
And so we connected
crazy anti-government and days preppers.
Yeah. So we connected the foundational stories of Mormonism to the behavior of Mormon or Latter-day looters, if you will, to what they're doing today, and to the harm that that's causing to indigenous communities. So shortly after the Decolonizing Mormonism book came out, Angelo Baca and I were both invited to participate in another anthology called Essays on American Indian and Mormon History. And this was hosted by Brigham Young University, actually. And P. Jane Hafen and Brendan Rinsink were the editors of this anthology. And ironically, I was surprised that, given the animosity I'd experienced from Farms and Fair many years before, that Brendan and Jane wanted me to write an article about DNA in the Book of Mormon for their anthology.
Were they part of Fair and Farms, or were you just kind of assuming just from a faithful believer?
Well, they're not part of Fair and Farms. They're at the Red Center at BYU,
Okay.
which is in the
But
history.
just you were grouping them together and maybe assuming that would be the treatment.
Yeah, that I would get treated similarly, but instead it was kind of more like the Mormon history crowd that I'd had such good experiences with in the past.
That's
But
good.
I actually turned down that request to write another article on DNA in the Book of Mormon. And instead I counter proposed an article that I'd been thinking about since I had started exploring my own family history. I'd been raised with these stories about an Indian princess in my family tree, which I had learned from Vine Deloria Jr. was a very problematic term. And I had been speaking with an elder, a Coast Salish elder, Rosie James, about these stories. And she's like, you really should look into those stories. And she said, she encouraged me to give voice to that, to this woman that's supposed to be my ancestor, and that living people are the ones that would give voice to the dead. And she kind of framed it in those terms, and like, well, you need to explore these stories. And so I'd started with my mother, kind of tracking down. My mother had done a lot of genealogy, my grandmother as well. Started tracking down those stories and tracked them to this what had been a Mohawk village along the Mohawk River in central New York, central to western New York. And it was known by the colonial name of Fort Hunter, and so I investigated this community that she supposedly come from, and I kept coming across all these really fascinating parallels with the Book of Mormon. And I was like, how is it that there could be some similarities between the Book of Mormon and stories of people from Fort Hunter?
Is it because the Book of Mormon is true?
Well, these stories were people in the 18th and 19th century. So that was the problem. I was, reading about this Sir William Johnson, that was an Irishman who became he became let's see, what do you call it, sir? He became a baron is the term that they used for his role in the French and Indian War. He was from the Mohawk side. He was adopted into the Mohawk a Mohawk family of a woman that he married, and he becomes a part of Molly Brant is her name. The woman that he married becomes a part of her family, and even gains a role as what Mohawks would call a royonnaire, or it's a sachem. So and I think in the English would call it a king, essentially like a king of the Lamanites.
Okay.
And you end up basically with this white person who becomes like a king,
a high-ranking.
Yeah, but he's a sachem in the Iroquois Confederacy, the Iroquois being the 6 nations of Mohawk, Oneida, Onondaga, Cayuga, and Seneca, and later the Tuscarora. And so, I mean, I'd always heard from my grandma that this ancestor was Iroquois, but I didn't know all the details of the story. I start digging in deeper and deeper, and I'm like, they even have these stories of like a Christ-like character in ancient America, very much like the Book of Mormon. They have, these sibling rivalries, very much like Laman and Lemuel versus Nephi and Sam. And in fact, there's 2 twin brothers in the Iroquois stories that are known as Flint and Sapling. And then I found this passage in the Book of Mormon that's saying Laman was like unto Flint. I'm like,
oh yeah,
whoa! Here's a reference to this Iroquois cultural hero being likened to Laman, and so I'm like, how are these? How could these stories be connected? And I had purchased a copy of Lori Taylor's dissertation, Telling Stories About Mormons and Indians, when I was doing my own dissertation, but I did not have time to read it. I really tried to get my dissertation finished and at best skimmed it. And so I remembered it, and I thought I need to go back and look at this dissertation. And so this historian, Lori Taylor, had stories that the Senecas were telling about collaborating with Joseph Smith in the production of the Book of Mormon, that they shared their stories with Joseph Smith. And I'm like, whoa,
yeah. That's new.
Yeah. I mean, I was very skeptical of this idea, but I thought, well, it could be an explanation that Iroquois people today, or Haudenosaunee, as they call themselves, Haudenosaunee, reading the Book of Mormon today, they say, oh, well, there must have been some way that those stories were transmitted. And there's even a direct reference to the Oneida Nation in the Book of Mormon as a place name. And so I got fascinated with that question. So I counter-proposed to Brendan Rensink and Jane Hafen that I write an article about the Iroquois Book of Mormon connections. So that was first published in Essays on the American
Was
Indian.
your issue trying to figure out how Joseph Smith would have heard of them to have incorporated them in the Book of Mormon?
I wasn't yet to that stage. At that point, I was like, let's look at the two different stories. So I framed it around the same approach that I had originally wanted to take to the Book of Mormon in relationship to Black Elk Speaks and the Popol Vuh as other scriptures, because that's the view I'd been introduced to in Guatemala, was Mayan and Ladino Mormons treating the Popol Vuh as an other scripture spoken of by Jesus in 3rd Nephi. And so I took that approach of looking at these indigenous stories as another sacred narrative, right? An indigenous sacred narrative, and reading the Book of Mormon in relationship to them. Later, I then wanted, and in my current book that I finished and is in the process of production now at the University of Utah Press, it's called Unsettling Scripture, Iroquois and the Book of Mormon. In it, I explore those questions. How might Joseph Smith have encountered these stories? That's a question that Lori Taylor had asked as well. And she gave me a lot of breadcrumbs to follow a trail. And so there were certainly interactions between Joseph Smith and Seneca and Cayuga, people that would come through the Palmyra area. He would often hang out with them, or at least he would be hunting and fishing in the same places that they would hang out, and probably most likely were encountering them, and probably most likely encountered Red Jacket, a Seneca orator who came through Palmyra and spoke in a public address. And 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 then I added to that, looking at something that Lori Taylor had not come across, is the encounters in Vermont and New Hampshire, where the Smith family was heavily involved with a educational institution known as Moore's Indian Charity School, that was kind of a predecessor and then an auxiliary to Dartmouth College. And a lot of these characters historical individuals who had similar stories to those in the Book of Mormon, were people associated with Moore's Indian Charity School. For example, the first graduate, Samson Occam, is very much like Samuel the Lamanite in the Book of Mormon. And so I was like, oh, maybe there's something going on here, that Joseph Smith is really kind of writing more of an allegory of his own time and place, and using Iroquois and Algonquian individuals to recent events in Iroquois Algonquian U.S. interactions as a
springboard,
as a type and shadow for what had happened in the past. Because the Book of Mormon frames them as types and shadows. And I think Joseph Smith saw history as repeating itself. And so he was taking what was familiar to him, the stories he was hearing, like about the Revolutionary War and that sort of thing, and projecting that back into the past in this epic story. Whether he was doing it consciously or unconsciously, who knows? But the result is that there are a lot of these allegories or types and shadows of recent 18th and 19th century individuals and stories and events projected back into ancient America in the Book of Mormon. And so that's the main topic of my forthcoming book.
Yeah, it's like finding Joseph Smith in the Book of Mormon.
Yeah. I mean, some people have done a great job of that, like Dan Vogel and Robert Anderson have done
and
a good job of that sort of thing. I'm more, it's not so much Joseph Smith as the stories that Joseph Smith had heard.
Right.
The stories.
Is your book finished and it's just in the like production stages? It's done being written, or are you still wrapping that part up?
No, it's written. It's been through peer review process, edits, and it's now in production stages at the University of Utah Press. It will come out in October or in the fall of this year. Okay. I don't know the exact date.
That was my next question. What's the expectation date there? Okay.
And so I hope that some of your listeners will look it up. It's not yet available for pre-order, but keep checking the University of Utah Press catalog, and it will be.
And hopefully we can have you on again when it comes out, just for another little reminder and take a look at some of those stories. Yeah,
I would love that. Yeah,
that's awesome. Thank you so much for coming on with us. I know it ended up going longer, but I think maybe Jean and I could have guessed. I think, given my background, that I would find this so fascinating. So anyway, I hope our audience does too. And I do wish more of this could get out. Like when we look at things that we're deconstructing that are in the CES letter, or in general, when we're kind of pulling apart these threads of the truth claims of this religion we grew up in, I really think that these indigenous stories, I think, should be a much, much bigger role. And I'd love to see them eventually just get more well known. I mean, among the consciousness in general, like a lot of these other issues have been. So I hope that that's what your book can do. I would like to see that for sure.
Yeah, when I presented portions of the book's material at the Conference on Iroquois Research in Brantford, Ontario, of course, the indigenous scholars and professionals working in Iroquois studies, of course, there's connections, and they're like, yeah, we heard these stories about Joseph Smith growing up, so it's obvious to them, but it's not so obvious to a Mormon audience. We want to see, what we want to see are dead Indians instead of living ones, and what this does is it shifts the narrative from ancient dead white Nephites to living indigenous neophytes, and the recasting of their stories in an ancient time.
Right. It gives them power back.
Yeah.
Which means that some is being, or maybe not necessarily being taken away. What's that phrase that when you're used to,
appropriated?
No, just when you're used to privilege, then equality feels like oppression, kind of a thing. White Mormons have had full control over the narrative of not just of Joseph Smith and early Mormons, to the exclusion of others, what was going on, but then also, of these Native and indigenous cultures. It's just another way that a group of people can be pedestalized, like women are pedestalized, but also not given any power. We also do that in the Book of Mormon and in certain doctrines, with these cultures, but they're not really welcome. There's not very many of them in the top levels of church leadership, and and we know
it's
why.
Like a literary murder, right? It's that instead of telling the stories of living people, it's the stories of dead ones.
Mm-hmm.
And not only that, fictional ones.
Fictional ones,
taking real people and making them fictional, right?
Yeah, mm-hmm. And so that we know that there's has been land that was taken away from the Native peoples in the Americas, and through Mormonism, their whole real life and culture has been taken away and exchanged for some a very unworthy fiction. And so I think that, shining a light of truth on what actually happened is going to ultimately be better for everyone. And so, yeah, thanks for coming on our show. I guess.
Look forward to having you back when
can't wait to have you back and talk more about the book and try to get more people to buy it. And to our audience, thanks for watching. Everybody like and subscribe and do the things, and have a great rest of 2025. Bye-bye.
Bye.